They're like, I want to be Rogan, or I want to be Lex, or I want to be Alex Cooper. I want to do the next serial. But you can't do that. Mr. Beast talks about this all the time. Like, you can't be a better Mr. Beast than Mr. Beast.
If you listen to this podcast, you're probably an avid podcast listener. Perhaps you've even dabbled with the medium yourself. And in a way, it does feel like we're at this interesting inflection point where it's both easier and harder than ever to podcast. It's easier than ever to create, but it's harder than ever to stand out. And I feel like this recent tweet from Tim Ferriss really encapsulates things. He says, I'm super grateful I started podcasting before you needed to produce a TV show to cut through all the noise and the algorithms. April of next year will mark an average of 1.4 plus episodes per week for 10 years. So look, there are endless creators that we can and probably will bring in to talk about this subject. But today we're talking to two creators that decided to go full force into the world of audio peak pandemic. You might know them as Sriram and Aarthi from The Good Time Show. Starting as a hobby, The Good Time Show has grown and since had many guests that you're probably familiar with. People like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Calvin Harris, and Naomi Osaka. So in this episode, we get to hear from Sriram and Aarthi about their perspective on the world of audio and video. We cover things like the sliding scale of entertainment, information, the difference between an audience and a community, podcast analytics and how those are changing, and even what Sriram has learned from his front row experience at Twitter recently. But first, they say that choosing a co-founder is like choosing a spouse. But in this case, Sriram and Aarthi are already married. So I decided to kick things off with a game to see who is pulling their weight in this podcast partnership. Place your bets. As a reminder, the content here is for informational purposes only. Should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investors or potential investors in any A16Z fund. For more details, please see a16z.com/disclosures. I know both of you are husband and wife, so I want to see a little bit of competition between the two of you, see who's pulling the weight on this podcast. But what we're going to do is I sent you both these buttons. You guys have them in front of you?
Yes.
Individually, press the record button and record your name.
Sriram.
Aarthi.
All right, we got it working. Okay. What we're going to do is a fun little trivia game about podcasting and creators, and I want to see which one of you knows more about this universe.
You should have told me this right at the beginning. He knows way more about this world than I do.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so I'm going to read the question, and then whoever hits their button first gets to answer. If you get it wrong, the other person can answer. All right? Ready?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So the first question, the term podcast is a portmanteau, which means it's a combination of two different words. What are those two words? I'll give you one. The first one is iPod.
Pod. Okay. And casting, I guess. Broadcast.
Yes. Aarthi got it. Second question. What year was this term coined?
I am going to go.
Say it. You press the button. Say it.
Well, it says iPod, so it must be post iPod. So I'm probably going to say 2004.
That's right.
Oh my
Sriram
God.
gets a point. We're 1-1. Okay.
I'm a genius.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Question 3. We're going to do these rapid fire. According to an Edison report, what is the most popular podcast genre?
Comedy.
Yes, that's right.
Oh.
All right, 2-1. Okay, so of the people who listen to podcasts, according to Infinite Dial, how many do they listen to per week? How many shows?
3.
Nope.
Well, let's see. Okay. Well, I'm going to say if somebody is
No, just say it. Number
8.
That's right.
Okay, you guys, this is not cool.
So it's 2-2. We've got 3 more. All right. How many downloads do you need per episode, according to Buzzsprout, to be in the top 1% of podcasts? And just round that up to the 1,000.
4,500. 4,500.
That's right. Yeah. So that's exactly right. It's 4,500.
It was in the prep doc.
I know. So I was testing who prepped.
Oh, that's unfair. I bring in spontaneity. I don't want to come
Not
in.
spontaneous enough pressing the button.
Fine. Let's get on with it.
All right. 2 more. Who was the highest paid creator in 2022?
I'm going to go
Say it.
Mr. Beast?
That's right. Okay, so we have one more question. It's tie. At what age did Jimmy Donaldson, aka Mr. Beast, start YouTubing?
Okay, you did it first.
I'm going to say 16.
Nope. Let's see who gets it closer. Aarthi, what's your guess?
How old is he now?
He's 24. 24, 25, something like that.
14?
That's closer. He started at 13.
Okay, I win.
All right, Aarthi wins.
That was fun.
This segment needs some work. I don't think talk about it afterwards. If I'd won, it'd have been better. But anyway, all right.
Lose with dignity.
Yeah, well, no such thing.
So, as I mentioned before, we are going to be talking about all things audio, creators, communities, social. So, why don't we just start out, because both of you have been podcasting for the last couple of years on your Good Time show, which started in 2020. What made you start that show? Was it the fact that you wanted to build a network? Was it just for fun? What was going through your mind at the time?
Kind of a happy accident. So this is 2020, December, kind of the thick of the pandemic, and we're all working from home. We miss seeing our friends. We used to go home to India once a year, and we didn't do that year. And, we basically thought, wouldn't it be nice to kind of host like a virtual dinner party kind of thing? Because we used to host all like these founders at home once a month or so, and just have conversations about building companies and startups and stuff. And we just didn't do that in person anymore. So we thought, we could maybe host this as a live audio session. We started this on Clubhouse, and that's kind of how the whole show started.
We can't tell you how much it was purely accidental and serendipitous. And in some ways, I think maybe these things have to be. I don't think you can set out in something like this because there's so much art and intuition involved. It kind of came from this very human core of we're bored, we like talking to people. It's really hard to talk to people during COVID, and we said let's have a place where we can have a friendly conversation.
Like the first few episodes were not like these, not shows. They were really like, how to go fundraise, how do you do performance reviews if you're a new manager, like very like advice sessions. And we would bring in experts we knew or other founders we knew, and it was more about giving back to that founder community. And we did a lot of those sessions, and it was fairly boring. It was just very like, we thought they were really cool and fun, but like, our parents or whoever would listen in and be like, what was that? Like, why are you guys talking on this thing?
Yeah. So it is really hard when you do one of these to know what is happening on the other side. You can't really picture the human being who's listening to it or watching it and what are they going through. But I would say there was definitely an inflection point where Aarthi, I remember the first few weeks, she would get all these DMs from India, from here, a lot of women. They would reach out and be like, oh, I can't believe you're there and you have Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk, and because your background is my background and I'm here.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about podcasting, it really does feel sometimes like you're searching for a needle in a haystack in terms of what's working. You get all types of feedback. Sometimes it's conflicting. Podcasting is also kind of notorious for really bad analytics or distribution. It really is this maze where you're like, I think something's working because people are listening, but it's really hard to tease out what is working. So where would you say the show is now? Like what kind of show are you trying to create?
We didn't start out with, we want to be creators. I see a lot of people who are like starting podcasts now where they're like, this is a theme and this is a show. And I keep trying to tell them, that's fine, but there's a very good chance that it's all going to change over time. And you might not see success right away with this exact vision that you have in mind. If you had told us 2 years ago, oh, you have to have this like whole setup with lights and everything and this backdrop and video and all of that, we would have been like, yeah, I don't think so. Like, I just don't think we are that. But now, it's given us the time and buffer to just like learn and grow through this and feel comfortable doing what we do. And so now I think the show, how would you describe where we are now?
I think many ways to measure it. We can kind of look at the numbers. We often get episodes now which get millions of views, and that's really amazing. Yeah. We really invested into video. So we really want to experiment with all different formats, which is a whole interesting other conversation also. One of the interesting thing about podcasts or anything here is you have to hold two things constant at the same time. One is I think it needs to have some kernel of truth and authenticity to it. I've seen so many podcasts fail, and they often fail because somebody wants to get out there and be like, I'm going to make a successful podcast. And I don't think that is a motivation that sustains you or the audience.
Well, it's also too broad, right? It's kind of like someone saying, I want to create a startup. It's like, okay, well, what do you want to build? What problem are you trying to solve? What are you excited about?
Absolutely, right? And it doesn't go anywhere. So I think you need some point of truth, which is you have to really care about the topic. You have to care about the topic and talk about it, even if nobody's listening to it. And I think the audience can sense, the level of authenticity. And they, in some ways, they have to really start connecting with you as the narrator, the guide, the Sherpa who's going to take them through this. And that sort of exists in this fuzzy sphere of human connection and intimacy and relationships. Then there is this other work, which is partnerships, metrics, views, retention, top of funnel, downloads, right? And it's incredibly quantifiable. And there is a game, there is an algorithm that you all need to play to. And I think, what we're trying to do is kind of balance both. Because at the end of the day, we don't do this for a living. We kind of do this for fun. And unless we enjoy it, just to stop.
The thing that hasn't really changed is we're kind of curious people. Even the show, when it started, I think we were just sitting around late night and being like, it'd be really nice to like have these folks to just talk to them. Like, we should just like ask them what they do, how they do what they do, kind of thing. And that hasn't changed 2 years in. And that's the part that I'm really excited about, where every guest, like, yesterday we did an episode, and the prep leading to the episode, that's the part we love and enjoy the most, because we are like, it's like this discovering this, like, this person, like, you've obviously read about them, heard about them, read their books or whatever they've done. But then when you have to prep, you really have to like know the individual and put some time and effort into it. And I think that we still enjoy that, and we're still very curious about who the person is, and kind of showing our audience, that side of them, whether they're like builders, thinkers, creators, whoever they are. That is the most fun for us.
Well, you know what I'm taking away, which is something that I've noticed with content for quite some time now, is a lot of people, to your point earlier, they're like, I want to create a blog, I want to create a podcast. And then once they decide to do that, they think about it too much in terms of what they're creating. So as an example, they might say, I want to create an interview style podcast about technology. And that's okay. But I mean, how many podcasts are there with that exact same what? And I think when you really consider why you listen to a specific podcast or read a specific newsletter, it's how they do it. And if I were to articulate what both of you do really, really well, is you make it approachable. The podcast feels warm, right? And even when you think about the way people articulate why they like a podcast or a newsletter, etc., it's that how part. You never go to someone and say, hey, I've got this great podcast. And they ask why. And you say, well, they talk about technology. No, because there's so many podcasts about technology. Right. You say, oh man, these hosts, they just make it feel so approachable. They're from my hometown or a town similar to mine. They have no ego. They're not afraid to ask, simple questions. And so I think that's really important as people consider whether they should pursue a podcast, because technically it's easier than ever. But that doesn't mean that, it's easy to start a podcast. And I mean, from that frame, I've been trying to figure this out myself, is the sliding scale between what I would call entertainment and information. Huberman Lab, I think, hit number 1 yesterday. Sriram, you shared that in a chat we're in. And I feel like that's very information dense. I go into the Huberman Lab podcast and I come out and I'm like, oh my God, I need to reshape my life. I'm doing everything wrong. And then there's other podcasts that, quite frankly, at the end of that podcast episode, I've taken nothing away, but I loved it, right? I truly enjoyed being there. How do you think about that sliding scale with your podcast?
You can't separate it from your own personality, right? The Human Lab, Andrew is amazing at it because he brings to the table, one, this amazing life experience, right? You should listen to him when he talks about his skateboarding life, and he's been in some dark times and overcoming that. That part of it, infused with the fact that he has this huge academic background, is genuinely curious, right? So one is you're putting yourself into it, and you can't really divorce yourself. When this show started taking off, I kind of went into this sort of analysis of all the great interviewers the last 20, 30 years, and I tried to kind of map out, kind of honestly steal from them on like what they were doing well, and and honestly trying to find some answers for us on what we were trying to do, because you're trying to square a circle, right? You're trying to square a circle of something which is authentic to you, something which is fun for you, something which is in some value to the audience. It can be information, it can be entertainment, something which is great for a guest if you have an interview kind of content, which is like they hopefully have a positive experience about it, and something kind of works, right, in terms of the algorithms and numbers. And you're trying to square this circle, and it seems as an impossible equation. And I was trying to go through history on trying who has kind of figured it out. And you realize, first of all, that everyone has their own style. And I'll give you a few examples of styles, right? Larry King, right? Maybe one of the greatest broadcasters, interviewers of all time. If you read his biography, if you read his style, he is all about, I'm going to go in assuming my audience knows nothing about this person. And actually, he's famous for doing no prep, right? But it brought it to this amazing purity, which he was like, what the heck are you working on? Tell me what you wrote, right? And because his audience doesn't know either, right? And he could sort of communicate the sort of this honest version of like some New Yorker on the street, be like, I don't know who this person is. Tell me what you got. What are you about, right? And there was an honesty to the conversation. Obviously, Larry King was one of the legends. That's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have somebody like Howard Stern, right? Howard Stern, he's maybe a polarizing character, but one of the things he likes to do is put in amazing research. Howard Stern with Jon Stewart, one of his first questions is he pulls out the very first joke Jon Stewart ever said in a public setting. And Stewart is bowled over, right? He's like, how do you ever find that? The other spectrum is sort of the vibe or the format of the show. So, for example, if you're doing a hard journalism show, right, you're doing 60 minutes, right? I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. I'm going to hold you accountable, right? That's one version of things. There's another version of things I think is closer to where we are, which is you are doing something interesting, and I want to understand, and the audience hopefully understand through me, how it is that you do what you do. I'm a huge fan of John le Carre, right? The famous espionage writer who tragically recently passed away. He hated doing press, really hated talking to journalists. He was in France, and he met this host for what he thought was some random French show. And he was like, God, I hate it. I don't even speak French. And this host, his name is Bernard Pivot. He hosted basically, let's call it the equivalent of the Tonight Show in France, right? I think he still does. And le Carre was nervous. He was like, I hate this. I don't even speak French, right? I'm going to make a fool of myself. I hate the whole endeavor, right? In the first 50 seconds, right? He's like, this is the most amazing conversation I ever had, right? And le Carre describes it so well. He says, it is not because Pivot was good looking, charming, funny, smart even. I mean, he probably was some version of all these things. But the thing was, within instantly he could communicate to the guest was, you are going to be okay here with me. When I saw that, right, and I'm not going to claim we even get close to any of that. When I saw that, this is what our goal is. Like every show, right, I want to have the guests be like, I'm going to be okay here. And I think if you get that, everything else really falls into place.
You know what? That reminds me of this analogy that I like to use for podcasts specifically, which is it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Let's say our podcasts are typically maybe an hour long. The listener is with you for an hour every week, maybe more than that. Mm-hmm. And so it's very different than reading a newsletter for 5 minutes or stumbling upon a blog post randomly online and spending a couple minutes where you don't even know who wrote it. And so it's a very intimate form of content. And so I like to frame it as like podcasts are your best friends. And so I think you're right that there's more of a friendship that needs to be created, not just with the person you're interviewing, but that parasocial relationship with the listener. And so that's where I think, I framed it as entertainment, but it's this warmth, it's this connection that you need to create. And I like the framing that you described there. It's like you're making someone feel comfortable, like they want to be there.
And you can't fake it. And sometimes it takes a lot of work. And it's not the same for every person. And a lot of the people who are at the very top of their field have kind of figured out a system of how to make things work. And I'm always trying to get that system out of them.
I think about it as getting them off their talk track. Aarthi, how do you think about that? How have you effectively, as you're going into these interviews with people who are so media trained and have done so many interviews, likely a lot of those interviews have the same questions being asked. And I've found, at least listening to both of your shows, like you do somehow find a way to get them off their talk track. Do you have any thoughts on how you've managed to do that?
Our job here is to, one, make sure that the guest feels like this is a good use of their time. They're here for an hour. They're usually really busy people. Our other job is to, we have all these people and we know our cohorts of audience who are like listening, watching, the show. They often tend to be not from the same world that we are, but aspirationally, they want to be here. They're typically founders or aspiring founders. They're young. A lot of them are very geographically distributed. And so for a lot of them, like I think of our job as to be in service of them and to make sure that we are able to bridge the gap between what would they want and what is interesting to them, and getting the guests to feel like they can convey that in that time frame that they have. It sounds really clinical when I put it that way, but really like an hour every week of somebody spending the time to listen is a huge investment on their part. And we want to make sure that it is actually valuable to them. I know what this person is working on, or what they're doing, or what the day to day looks like, or the book that they wrote, or anything of that sort. But I think it is still worth it to ask the question, so that the person who's listening on the other end gets the value out of it, because I can't assume that they know. And so some of the questions might just be like, what advice do you have for founders, kind of thing. And it sounds so basic, but sometimes that's kind of where you get interesting answers, and that kind of breaks them out of that mold of the PR spiel, which is they're here to go launch their book and they can talk about the book. But then I'm like, no, wait, but you did that. Why did you start that company? Why did you do this thing? And they're like, oh, wait, you're actually interested in me as a person who did that. Okay, let me talk to you about that.
I also think about the curse of knowledge, right? You mentioned that sometimes it's the simplest questions that people get really excited about. And I'm sure all of us and people listening have put out content before trying to sound really smart or say, this is like so thoughtful. I spent, 2 months on this, and then it flops. And sometimes it's the simplest things that people just really latch onto, the really human things. But ultimately, I think what's also important to consider is that a podcast is effectively a product, right? And so you are getting, even though it is limited with podcasting, some signal back. So I want to hear from both of you, because it does sound like you are quite glued into the metrics. What are you learning? What are you paying attention to? And what has worked in terms of actually growing your show?
You absolutely have to think of it as a product. Who's your market? Who are your customers? What are you building for them? How are you finding them? How are they finding you? How are you getting them to the door? Are they staying? There's just the basic questions of any product, especially in the consumer world. Really go for podcasts also. And often a famous name can help with that, which is you get an Elon Musk, A.R. Rahman, who's huge in India. A lot of people who have no idea who you are will find you, right? But that is a one-time value. But how do you retain them? And what we have found is retaining them is because they start to hopefully trust us, and they listen to more of our conversations, and then they go from just top of funnel person to a DAU or a WAU in consumer software terms. The other thing I think from the product world we realize is fast iteration. Like we've changed multiple things. We try out things all the time about everything from thumbnails to how we handle social, how we
trailer, the first few seconds of like a retention hook.
Oh yeah, because if you don't try, you don't know what's working or not.
I think what Sriram said, which is you get these acquisitive episodes, which are like big guests. Like I think A.R. Rahman for us last year was a really big get. He's a one of the most famous people in India and world over now. But I really look for retention, which is like and this is the cliched. We came for this guest, but I'm staying for you both kind of thing. And we get comments like this all the time. That's kind of when we know we're doing our jobs, because people are watching a lot of the episode content. Oftentimes we see the average number of minutes a user watches like anywhere between 12 to 15 minutes of our episode, which is like 25% of the episode. We also look for like retention overall. Like if you're new user who subscribed, are you coming back and listening to new shows that we're putting together every week, kind of thing. So I look for that.
And you probably know this because you're doing this too. You have a very strong intuitive feel for when something is working, because it's your email
catches fire everywhere.
Your email lights up. People
let you know.
Yeah.
People let you know, right? And you also know the opposite when something totally didn't work, and it's just dead silence. And the hard part sometimes is when that mismatch your expectation or your calibration, when you think something's going to work and totally bombs. And
I was going to say the other direction's brutal, but
we've had that too. We've had a lot of those, and oftentimes it's because we didn't quite understand how to get the best out of this guest. Something about the way we had like tried to make this conversation and these points and the communication style work didn't resonate with the listeners.
Sometimes, and I'm more guilty of this in Aarthi, is often we go into an episode already wanting a certain kind of episode. Okay, and you have this guest. You're like, and sometimes it's from a very good place. You're a fan, you know their work, you want to sort of fanboy out over a thing, or you're thinking this person expert in X, Y, and Z. Let's ask them X, Y, and Z because they're very good at it, and it's going to work with your audience in a particular way. It's going to work with your team.
Yeah.
And when you do that, sometimes it works, but sometimes it has a certain level of artifice and artificial constraint to what is really free-flowing human conversation.
Yeah.
And I think the audience can feel it. The guests can feel it. And then it's hard to describe, but there is something about that. And to be honest, I don't have an answer to that. Like sometimes you have to, because somebody's launching a new book or a new movie, you have to ask about it. That's great, right? It's kind of part of the deal because they want to promote it and it's amazing. Sometimes if you're a fan, you want to ask them about like that particular thing. And I've tried to get better at it. I've tried to give more space and just follow the conversation. But it's a tricky.
And to your point, the listener can tell. I mean, Sriram and I were talking about this before we started recording, and I had the same thing. I'm new to this role, and the first couple podcasts I did, I way over prepared, and I did exactly what you're saying, where I was like, there's an arc. People want to hear about X from this person. I'm going to make sure I get it out of them. I'm going to make sure I ask this really amazing, well-crafted question. And then to your point, sometimes that works, and sometimes it just feels really fabricated. And going back to the analogy of podcasts kind of being like people's best friends, imagine showing up to a friend's house and there's some other friends there and someone is like, we have to talk about this today. We have to, we have to follow this conversation arc. And I think, sometimes if people want to talk about that, it's in the news and everyone's excited about it. Great. But when it doesn't feel organic, like think about how strange that is in real life. It feels the same on podcasts.
It totally is. And I'll say, right, sometimes, I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I'll do something where I think the underlying psychology is like, I'm going to show you how smart I am about this topic.
Oh, totally. Sriram loves to
you
pull
agree
that.
so quickly. Yeah,
he loves to do that. He'd be like, so when you did this and then you followed up with this, in your mind, was this what you were thinking and feeling?
Hold on.
No.
Right? I would say the place where it comes from is sometimes when you're a fan, you meet somebody and you want to show them that you've done the work. I do like a 1 minute thing of like, well, you obviously did this, and this, and I'm going to hit
and
you.
And then
with
in this year you did that, and you wrote this, and they'd be like, They'd be like, where does he go?
Yeah, but
and then finally he'll be like,
I'm laughing because I do the same.
Yeah. Well, okay, here's I'll give you a very surprising thing, which I didn't realize, right? It surprised me for sure, right? I was talking to a really famous person about interviews, one of the most famous people in the world. And I was asking them, and they said, you know what? When a fan interviews me, right? One, it's amazing because this person's a fan of your work, your craft, movie, book, whatever. It's great. You feel good about it. But you also feel real pressure, right? Because if that person asks you, right, like let's say you're interviewing Michael Jordan, you're like, tell me about, crossing over Byron Russell and winning the game. Yeah, and you're like, God, I've told the story like 100 times before. This person has heard that story. I am now on the spot to deliver something because this person's such a fan.
Now they have to perform for you.
But also they have to perform for you, but they want to because they're like, this person's so... I mean so much to them. I need to give them something, right? Mm-hmm. And they feel pressure too. And pressure is never a good spot for a conversation.
Sriram comes from this place of like the generosity of spirit where he wants to make this work, and you can see the yearning.
All right, let me give you the real secret sauce of podcasting.
Okay, let's hear it. Yes.
Aarthi kicks me under the table here, right? And she thinks I'm going on too long for a story, right? She's like, that is me. And, I leave as an exercise to listener to be like, if you can spot the moments in every episode.
Now I have to know how many kicks there have been in this podcast so far.
An exercise. You can share. It's
I was going to say, I think my secret weapon, which is many podcast hosts' secret weapon, is your editor. I think a lot of people who are listeners forget that. They're like, oh my gosh, you were so concise. You asked such great questions. I'm like, you didn't hear the ones I cut out. But I want to at least kind of end this segment about podcasting with a question, which I think, to the point of delivering value to listeners, even though it is very much an art, are there any tricks, any growth hacks, anything that was like an 80-20, whether it was something as simple as like choosing the right thumbnails, whether it was choosing to do video instead of just audio? Are there any things that maybe a new podcaster should really keep in mind as like, okay, just make sure you check these boxes?
So there is this expression which sounds very mean, which is use all parts of the buffalo. And so basically sounds very mean to buffaloes, I'm sorry. But that is the expression I can't say. But we do this. We have, say, an hour and a half of a video file and a bunch of audio files, right? Like that's the thing we have. Now, what I think you need to do is to take that and then repurpose that in every single way for every single platform. And somebody like Gary Vaynerchuk does this really, really well, where he puts a lot of effort to take every bit of content and make it the most native version possible for each platform. So for example, right, that means on YouTube, you have to really into video. On audio, you want to have amazing sound engineering. You want to make it sound good. You want to have lead in intros. You want to cut it up into short versions for a Reels or a TikTok. And then you want to extract the text out of it and the learnings and put it on Twitter or on Substack. One of the ways to think about it is your podcast is actually really hard because if you look at the native podcast platform, say just Apple, there is no discovery mechanism. There is no algorithm, right? So it's really word of mouth. But a lot of other platforms have discovery mechanisms like Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, obviously. And the more you are native to what that platform wants, the easier.
I think what's important there is we talked about a podcast being kind of like a product. If you're founding a company, you're not just like, hey, we're going to create this product. We're going to put it on one distribution channel and we're just going to keep it the same forever. You test a bunch of different things out. You test marketing channels, you test copy, you iterate the product. Another thing I want to hear from you about is this difference between what you might call an audience and a community. Something that I think is interesting that you've ventured into recently is these in-person events and really translating what you're doing digitally into something physically. Audience is kind of unidirectional. A bunch of people listening to your podcast, but a community, there's connections within the communities of listeners to other listeners, and then also in reverse from you as hosts back to the community as well. And so how are you thinking about that?
That's the goal. That's the long-term goal. We want to have these cohorts of people, when they engage with us, it's not just value from our show and our content, but from each other being in that same cohort, right? Like that's, I think, the ideal end state for us. That day, that evening, when we had people coming in, that's, I think, kind of when it hit both of us, where we were like, this is really cool. We have a couple hundred people here who showed up for no reason other than to just come see us in person and hang out with us. And to us, we were like, wait a second, like we've kind of gone from just being these podcast hosts who are like goofy, getting guests to like show up, to being like, we can now have these people, and a lot of them there, I think like 70% of them are like founders. And it was great because they all got value from just talking to each other.
One of the most interesting pieces I ever read on this topic is Kevin Kelly's legendary 1000 True Fans. Basically, the idea is that if you're creating anything of any product, you want to find your first 1,000 really true fans, right? Who will consume anything that you do and they trust you. If you do that, you're really off to the races. And I think the community really comes from that, which is, are these people connecting to each other? Are they finding value outside of just what we do? And look, we are not doing this as a job. We only really want to do this if people are going to be like, oh, this helped me build a company, or this helped me get ahead in my career. When we did this event, a lot of people met each other. There are now folks who are thinking of doing a meetup even without us. Will this grow? I don't know. But I think you do need some sort of that kind of goal or mission to fuel you.
Well, what's your mission in that case? Because you both said you just kind of stumbled into this for fun. It's been going well. You like it. But to my knowledge, you're not running ads on it. I don't think you're going to sell to something like Spotify. And so what is the end state of this? Like, what are you looking towards building this?
We really believe that technology entrepreneurship is one of the biggest forces for good in the world, in all the ways that you mean the word good. And we want to find...
It's literally benefited us.
Oh yeah, it's literally benefited us. Like, we would not have met without technology. We met online, 20 years ago. Our jobs, everything that we have. So this is our way of maybe giving back.
It's not as catchy as other companies' mission statements and stuff, but it works for us.
You know what? I have to ask you guys, you seem very aligned on a lot of your answers. Like, what do you guys disagree on? You guys are a married couple. I don't know if you guys know this. I have a separate podcast from the A16Z podcast that I do with my husband. And let me just say, we don't agree on everything.
Oh, no, all the time.
No, we do disagree quite a bit.
I get kicked under the table a lot.
I mean, I think part of it is this. We've known each other for half our lives now. I think last year was the year where we've known each other for more time than not knowing each other. So I think it's taken us a while to get to this point where we agree on a lot of things, on at least on an abstract sense of it, but the details of it, we still differ and disagree quite a bit.
That's where a lot of the magic is, because we bring such different lenses, and this is everything, choice of guests, how does the thumbnail look, kinds of questions, are we spending too much time on something, not enough time on something, something even broader, what should we call the show, and it's constant discussion and back and forth, and and Aarthi's often mostly right.
Our lenses are different. I'm very left-brained as a person. I'm also much more introverted. And I look at it as a very, what are they here for? What do we have to convey kind of thing. I look at it in like, it has to be really clean, like the narrative in the story. I think Sriram is more of like a
Artist.
he's a showman. He brings high energy. He's very extroverted. People love, like, you can see them even before we hit the record button. They're already yapping away. They like spend 20 minutes just chatting. And I'm like, stop, save this like material for the show. And they just love being in the room with him and just chatting with him. Styles.
Aarthi, I think also like was one holding the show honest. Right, like she be the one which is like, hey, we need to do this for this person, right? Like this question. She's the one often holding me honest, and sometimes I'm often a creative tangent, a weird tangent, and I think we balance it out.
But yeah, we do disagree a lot.
Yes.
It doesn't show. Sriram, I want to ask you about community as well. You've been creating these WhatsApp chats with a bunch of creators, and they're great. And I can't believe, I mean, Aarthi, you mentioned this like energy that Sriram has. Like, I don't know how you're always posting in there, finding all these things from Twitter or elsewhere. Like, how are you thinking about building those communities?
I think there's kind of been a shift in the way we think about social media and online conversation. So, for example, like 15 years ago, when Twitter first started, around 2008 or 2007, you would just come in there and you would post what you had for lunch, and it was perfectly fine. And everyone was just kind of a small set of friends. Nobody's going to dunk you, and then it shows up in the national, media the next day. What is social media? What is online community? Has changed in many, many exciting ways. Right? We've seen the rise of YouTube, and then Instagram, and then Snapchat, and then TikTok, and then BeReal, and Discord, and I can keep going on and on.
The types of posts we would do on Facebook is so funny, right? We'd just be like, going to the store or like meeting a friend, and people liked that. Now it's very different. The bar is much higher, but it's also bifurcated in a way where you have something like TikTok, which is more topical. I'd be remiss not to ask you about your experience at Twitter and where you see that evolving, or how you see the kind of whole matrix of social, because if people aren't aware, you obviously have had some pretty intimate involvement in the recent acquisition by Elon, and at least you got to see kind of you got a front row seat.
Well, I think what's happened is, if you go back 5-6 years ago, it felt like social media was in a bit of a stasis, right? You had 2-3 companies which really dominated. I worked for some of them, and you kind of posted in ways where you expected everything was going to be public. But in the last few years, I think you've seen an explosion of innovation. And things have shifted in a few dimensions. We've moved from a follower graph to now having AI and recommendations drive so much of what we do. YouTube, recommendations drive a lot of it. TikTok, the follower graph almost really doesn't matter. It's really the For You page that really matters. Twitter is obviously experimenting with it. So that's one dimension. The other dimension, I would say, is in kind of the size of the spaces. Mark Zuckerberg was saying in, I think sometime recently, that so much of the conversation now on Instagram is somebody takes an Instagram post and then sends it to a group chat, and it sparks off a conversation. So you're kind of this public to private space transition happening in ways that just wasn't happening before. Third, I spent all of my day job when Aarthi's not kicking me under the table, working on crypto. But one of the core ideas behind it is that, power to the people and decentralization. The idea that, hey, instead of one central set of people running everything and calling the shots and having all the economics, how do we do it in a way where these things are no protocols and everyone has collective ownership? So there are a bunch of these sort of zeitgeist shifts happening. And as you said, I was briefly helping Elon at Twitter. I was there on the Let It Sink In day, and it now feels like social is active and alive again. There was a time when you're like, well, I have Facebook, I have Instagram, I have Twitter, maybe Snapchat, and that is that, right? That's going to be all the social media anybody ever needs. And that is not true anymore.
Yeah. Aarthi, I want to hear your perspective on this idea of the creator economy and specifically the creator middle class. So we've seen the rise of the independent creator over the last few years. And I think in some spaces, you could say text especially, we've seen independent creators be able to kind of lucratively monetize their followings through that. Audio is interesting because if you actually look at the top podcasts, the charts, they're all people who had large distribution, who are already successful, who already had reach, who are really dominating there. And you could say that's partially because of the discoverability or monetization that exists within audio. But do you have any thoughts there on whether we're really going to be able to build this quote unquote creator middle class within audio specifically?
You are kind of what you measure, right? And with audio, there's just not a whole lot that's measurable right now. A lot of it is just like hidden behind like these big black boxes. Right at the beginning, we played this game, you're looking at like 4,500 downloads an episode to make it to 1%. So where does the chart fall off? Like, what is distribution like? Who's getting that? There's no transparency of metrics. I think if you have better metrics and better discoverability, just helping creators be successful with more tools, I think you're going to get there. But I think the other part of it is at the end of the day, if you're making money through brands or sponsorships or any of these, brands need to start seeing value, right? And I think that feedback loop is not quite there yet, where it's like, well, okay, this person talked about this product, they gave a coupon code, the attribution system behind it. Like a lot of it is still super early days. We haven't kind of cracked that feedback loop. So it's going to happen, but I think it's just going to be a while. And just like any other, like, social networks, a lot of the top percentile or couple percentile creators are going to have like an outsized kind of return and impact. And then there's this big long tail of folks that you're going to see.
I kind of sort of disagree with you that all these people are big audiences, because we look at the top charts, right?
Yeah.
We look at Huberman did not have a large audience at all, came out of nowhere.
That's true. Yep.
To be on the top of the charts. Lex Friedman came out of nowhere, really, to build one of the most popular podcasts around. There are definitely obviously celebrities. For example, Emma Chamberlain has one of the popular podcasts around.
I think you're right that these people didn't have followings, but I think they didn't burst into the scene. I think the thing that we're missing is it took a really long time for a lot of these folks to like keep chipping away at it. It just looks to us like overnight successes because it suddenly got into the zeitgeist and everybody's like Huberman, Lex, and you just hear that in like your echo chamber that you are in. But they've been doing this for years now. I think that's kind of going back to the point of just takes a while. Like all of these, like the breakout stars don't break out overnight. It just takes like 5, 6, 7 years to get there.
Yeah, which maybe somebody listening to this and they want to start their own podcast. I will say, there's this amazing stat. It's like 90% of podcasts don't last to episode 20, and then the remaining 90% don't last to episode 40. That is so true. So if you're doing a podcast, a couple of things. Number one, you have to really enjoy doing it every single week, because if you don't enjoy it, you will not make it to episode 20. You'll definitely not make it to episode 40. So you kind of have to look into yourself, right? And don't look to the numbers, because numbers will be zero for quite a bit of time. And that's really hard for people.
Make it to 40 and then you can talk about whether you want to quit or not.
Well, that is true. Because once you make it to 40, you would have learned so much about the art of podcasting, what is working, what is not. The other thing I actually couldn't tell people, and this was earlier, about the product market fit and how we think about a startup, is I sometimes see podcasters when they do their very first podcast, they record an entire season before launching. And that is bad. Yeah. Because I think what happens is you're getting no feedback, right? I was talking to this person and they had recorded, I think, like 15 episodes, in back to back, and they're putting it out. They're going to put it off like 3-4 months. And this person, maybe this will really work. But the problem is, like, when something isn't working, they're not getting the feedback. They can only react on it like next year. And that's really hard because you need to react on it week to week. Your OODA loop, your observe, orient, decide, act, that loop needs to be super short. Put an episode, look at what's happening, change it up the next week, change it up the week after. And that iteration cycle, by episode 40, you'll be so dramatically better than you were in episode 1.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, both of you have been founders or have grown companies to significant size. What would be interesting is just to hear from you as people who have created podcasts. And as we've talked about a couple times here, the infrastructure is not great. We don't really get as much signal as we'd like. The tooling is pretty nascent, at least as we compare it to something like text. If you put your founder hat on, are there certain companies or gaps that you think really need to be addressed that could help podcasters like you and I?
There are a few parts to look at this, right? One is the content, the guest booking. Like we look at the whole funnel of the podcast, right? And if you look at it, there's the initial part, which is like the prep, getting the guest booked on our show, actually hosting the conversation, recording it, the tools for recording it, all of that. There, if you look at it, initially it used to be super manual. The tools were not that great. Guest booking was like Calendly chaos of like going back and forth between the three of us. And so like a lot of that has like gotten a bit more streamlined. Then post-recording, we used to struggle with like, okay, transcripts, what do we do now? Break this into clips so that it's bite-sized and consumable. We want Insta Reels. What do we do there? TikTok has to look different, feel different. Shorts is a little bit different. Like it has to be under a minute. Now reels are like can be a little bit longer. So you kind of sort of have to figure this out. And now I think tools like Descript has been helpful. There are lots of other tools that are like now coming in, playing a really good role there. And then post, right? Like looking at metrics and stuff. We use Anchor, we use Simplecast, we look at like podcast download numbers. YouTube has been really good. Like I really like the studio metrics page. There are a lot of these like tools that are now coming in and just getting really good, and practically like month to month you're seeing like step function changes in what value they're offering. So I do think we are in like a really interesting time now. We tried to prep for a couple of episodes by pushing it to ChatGPT. And that was kind of fun because we fed it like a bunch of like, this is an author, these are the books they've written.
Hold on. Here's what happened. Okay? We forgot to prep for an episode.
The truth comes out.
Right? And then Aarthi at the last minute was like, I don't know what to ask. And then so she fed it into ChatGPT and we got a bunch of stuff. We're like, it's actually pretty good. Right?
Yeah, I actually sent the questions to Sriram and Sriram was like, yeah, these are pretty good. And I was like, I did not come up with them. ChatGPT did.
You know, it's so funny. I have to confess. So for the trivia at the very beginning, around half of those questions, I just asked ChatGPT, what are some interesting fun facts about podcasting? I came up with a few on my own, but yeah, ChatGPT was my little assistant as well.
I think sometimes in the future, there's going to be like just like, you know, when you buy a product from the supermarket, like, you know, what content is going to be like, this was purely human generated. There's only 10% of AI participation in this podcast.
Yeah. You know, I heard Mark actually talk about this on a recent interview with VJ, and he talked about Mad Men, which is one of the most popular TV shows of, I think, all time. And the writers of the show talked about how they would sit in a room and they would come up with a bunch of different plot lines. And they would come up with them partially because they were like, let's get all the obvious stuff out of the way. Let's just like write what everyone expects. And Mad Men has now become known for the fact that they actually, like, you don't know what's going to happen. You think you do, and then it goes, you know, it takes a left turn. And so I think that's another way where even as I was preparing for this interview, I was like, yeah, let's use ChatGPT. Some of it's okay, some of it's good, but even the good stuff, like, let me come up with better questions than what it's outputting here. Like, these are the obvious things that everyone expects to ask that I can almost guarantee that a previous interview has asked. And so, I also think it's a tool to like push
us. It's a good generic baseline, I think. And I think it's important to see what that baseline looks like so that you can actually like do the work.
It's like a median, it's like a median version of humanity, right? It's like if you put right, and you Google and you had to write up something about this person, you know, what would you get? And it kind of gives you some version of that.
Yeah, well, the truth has come out for both of us. We're already using the AI to help with our interviews. All right, I want to close things out with a question because both of you have had the very cool opportunity to talk to some of the most impressive people in the world. I mean, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Calvin Harris. So we're talking like across industries or skill sets as well. And something that came to mind as I was thinking about what question to ask you about all these wonderful folks that you've spoken to is something that I've heard Naval talk about, which is being jealous of someone, a celebrity, for example, isn't very productive because if you really think about it, if you really think about every aspect of their lives, like who their loved ones are, like how they spend their day, how wealthy they are or not, ultimately it's very rare, if true at all, that you would want to trade every aspect of your life for that person's life instead of just comparing, you know, one sliver of it. But I thought that frame might be interesting to ask you, of all the people you've talked to, who would you actually want to trade lives with? Who were you most like, wow, in every aspect of talking to this person, like their stature, their warmth, their personality, the happiness they bring to life? Like, was there someone that you were like, wow, this person, you know, maybe unexpectedly has really captured me, and I really like respect the way that they've led their lives?
Well, it's a very good question. By the way, if I remember, the original Naval quote was somebody asked him in a party about Steve Jobs and how would they allowed to be Steve Jobs, and Naval would tell them like Steve Jobs is dead, right? Like Steve Jobs would do anything to be you, and I actually, it's going to sound like cliche, but in some ways, there's no real one person you want to be because in crypto, there's a sense of you know, we talk about proof of work and proof of stake, and when you talk to somebody, you know, like they have done the work. Right. For example, let's say somebody is into this, they'd be like, well, why can't I be transplanted into Elon Musk and, you know, I have billions of dollars and I have all these companies and it'd be fun. But Elon Musk is not that. Elon's sort of a sum of his experiences and all the journey, and that's what makes him uniquely him. So I don't mean sort of very, very philosophical about this, but I don't think there's one person I would really want to transplant into, because I would never be that person. I would be me in living that person. It might be fun for a day or two, but ultimately I would probably get bored because I haven't seen the journey. What I've tried to do is like maybe steal things or been really impressed by things from certain people. They come in different dimensions. For example, Mark, he's just an encyclopedia of everything, right? He's out off the cuff, he'll quote some like 50-year-old book, at which page number, and you're like, how do you have this in your head? Like, this is crazy. We had like Anders Helsberg, who is a legendary programming language designer, and I think he's worked in one problem for 40 years and just honed that craft where he's the best in that in the world. And there's something so romantic and pure about that notion of like, you work on one thing and you're going to be undisputably the very best in the world at it. And every one of these times where I'm like, could I steal some version of what that person has and apply it to my own life and my own job?
Based on your question, I'm like, would I be here or would I be there? I would rather be here. We are having the time of our lives, just bantering across, me kicking him under the table. Usually we record these. A lot of these are like late at night. Our kids are asleep. So we like have like an iPad here. These folks are all really great. They're very impressive. But they don't have the life that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather do this than anything else.
Yeah, which is also great piece of advice. I think everyone trying to be creative, right? They're like, I want to be Rogan, or I want to be Lex, or I want to be Alex Cooper. I want to do the next serial. But you can't do that. And not because you're not talented or capable, but you're not them. Right? They are doing the thing which works for them. And Mr. Beast talks about this all the time. Like, you can't be a better Mr. Beast than Mr. Beast, right? Because it is so native to him, right? You need to find the thing which works for you and then be the very best at it. You can't be better Alex Cooper and call her daddy than what she does. You can't be a better Rogan. So you kind of have to learn from them, but you have to do it your way. So, steal from them, learn from them, see what's working, but you have to infuse yourself into it.
Yeah. If you listen to his Joe Rogan episode, there's a part where Joe is talking to him about him dreaming up thumbnails and this idea where Mr. Beast has worked on coming up with YouTube video titles for years. And he prompts him. He gives him a word. I think he says like dog or something. And the title that Mr. Beast comes up with in that moment, I was like shocked. It was so good, given that his brain had processed it for like a millisecond. And so, to your point, we're all these AIs that have been trained on a data set, which is our lives. And you can't really just copy and paste that to someone else's life.
Like Mr. Beast, he's a savant about online video. I'll give you an example. You watch his interview with Lex Friedman, right? In the middle, he's like, Lex, while we're talking, all I'm seeing is your metrics in video, right? When we had him on our Clubhouse show, right? You could see him being like, this part is boring to the audience, right? There's a part of his brain which is always like, is this interesting? Is it boring, right? And it's been trained like a neural net over millions of videos that he's watched, and he's saying it all the time. You cannot compete with him on that, but you'll be the best at something else, right? Like he can't, Mr. Beast is not an Indian couple, 20 years and, have a bunch of jobs and so on. So you have to be the best. This is going to sound like, I don't know, some self-help book, but like you have to be the best you possible.
Someone's going to clip that, but no, I couldn't agree more. And just for listeners, one tip to maybe surface that is if you've ever been in a situation where someone has asked you, how did you notice that? That is something that your brain is more trained around than other people. So for me, I've been a marketer for a while, and I'll just be like driving down the street and I'll be like, do you see that sign on the back of that truck? Like, that's genius marketing. Or like I'll be at the movie and I'll see some copy, and I'm always pointing this out kind of subconsciously. And then people will be like, how did you notice that tiny little thing somewhere? And I guarantee everyone listening has aspects of that in their own life where people are just like, dude, like, where'd that come from? Like, why are you paying attention to that? Because to everyone else, they've drowned it out. But maybe if you're a designer, you notice like the aesthetic within a restaurant differently than someone else. And so I think that's a wonderful place to end off. Thank you so much, both of you, Sriram and Aarthi. This was so fun. And, we'll have to do this again sometime.
There was almost no kicking. So
what's our kick count at the very end?
Just
one.
Yeah. The audience can email us or tweet at us at where that was. We leave it as an exercise to the listeners.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to the A16Z podcast. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube to get our exclusive video content. We'll see you next time.